morning. This is Jan Martin once again, and I'm coming to you today from my kitchen. And what we're going to do today is talk about sourdough and how we can make sourdough bread and sourdough biscuits and all kinds of things. But first, we're going to talk about just the whole idea of baking. And for hundreds of thousands of years, people were taking flour or ground grain in the early days. I mean, they did not have the ability to get flour near as fine and refined as we have today. And they would mix it with water. So we're going to do a little mixing of some flour. I've got 3/4 of a cup of flour, and I'm going to add, find the right measuring cup, 1/3 of a cup of water. And in my house, I use the water that we would use for drinking because we have a water softener and it makes the water taste, makes baked goods and things taste kind of funny. So now I am just mixing up the flour and the water in the bowl. So I'm making a mixture, and it's kind of gluey looking, kind of lumpy. And I have nothing in here besides flour and water, which is very unusual because when we bake, usually we have a lot of other things in the dough to make it tasty. Well, early people, as they were discovering growing grains and making dough, they didn't have that luxury. So I'm just going to leave this sit a minute and go now over to my different things that people would add. Last week, I did the experiment with yeast. Yeast is one of the ways that we combine the flour and the water and other ingredients, sugar and other things, to get a loaf of bread rising, and it gets real soft and fluffy. Other things that we use that people have discovered over time are baking soda. And baking soda is nothing but sodium bicarbonate. And in doing some research, it was the first real industry for baking soda occurred as the settlers that went from the east, from Illinois and Missouri, over to Salt Lake, to the Utah territory. And near the Great Salt Lake, they found this patch of white stuff. The women decided to experiment because they had been making just sourdough bread, and they found this baking, they, in its raw form, discovered that this was another way to help make bread rise, to go from just this flat dough to a risen dough. Another element that has been used for many, many hundreds of years is cream of tartar. Again, it's another natural ingredient that comes from grape juice that's left from turning the grapes into wine. So cream of tartar, as a byproduct of the winemaking industry, has been around for thousands of years. And this is one, especially if you're working with lots of eggs, you're making things that you want to get real fluffy, a meringue, you use cream of tartar. And then the other ingredient that a lot of people use is baking powder. Baking powder is a mixture of baking soda and several other ingredients that also help bread rise or baked goods rise. Because if you were to forget the baking soda from cookies, you'd have really flat, hard cookies. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. So one of the earliest things people discovered is when they mixed their flour and their grain and their water together, and they left it for a little while, it would start to foam. It would start to get some bubbles. So this is an example of that. This is my flour and water mixture, just like I put together in the other bowl. But this one is already, it's a day old, and this is the start of sourdough. This is and I've got another one to show us. This one kind of erupted overnight, so it's time to put this in a bigger jar. But this is sourdough that's about 5 days old, and it has got lots and lots of bubbles. And if we had smell-o-vision, it would smell a little bit like vinegar, and that's telling us the natural yeast that's in the air is interacting with the water and the flour, and it's using the flour for food and becoming mixed. Now I put the lid back on because that way it protects it from contaminants in the air. So now what we're going to do is start the sourdough. And my recipe, which is linked, the recipe I've been using for the last couple of years is linked to this presentation. And it calls for 3/4 cup of flour plus 2 tablespoons. The reason for that odd measurement is the fact that we are looking for an arrangement of flour and water that is equal in weight or mass, as if we were to talk about this in scientific terms. And baking is a science because we're looking to get the same results every time. And so in order to do that, you have to be fairly precise in your measurements. So I've got 3/4 cup of flour and 2 tablespoons. To that, I'm going to add a 1/2 cup of water. And so the 1/2 cup of water, just pour it into the jar. And I'm using right now, this is a plastic container. Glass or ceramic is best. This is just one that I had on hand, so it's going to be good for demonstration purposes. I probably won't keep this starter going. But you're going to want to mix it. And this is an easy thing to do. You just want to get it mixed until the water and the flour is all mixed together. And it's kind of almost turns into a ball-like consistency. Very similar to what I got in my other bowl. So I'm going to put the lid on it. And this originally had a rubber seal. I took the rubber seal off because you want a little bit of air to get in it. So you don't want it sealed tightly. So I'm going to put this one to the side. And because now sourdough is a hungry critter, I'm going to add more flour. You have to feed the sourdough for at least 5 days. Sometimes, if you're lucky, 4 days will work, but you're going to do it for 5 days. And then you're ready to start using the sourdough. And when you start mixing more flour and water into the previous mixture, you'll experience some changes. You'll see that the stuff you had, the dough you had in the jar already is starting to get, it's a little lighter in texture and things of that nature. So it's starting to form its own yeast. And I'm going to just close this up for now, because what I need to do now is talk about what you do with your starter over time. So now this starter is, well, it's over a year old, but it took some naps. I put it in the refrigerator. I even dried some of the starter and use it just like you would use yeast, but this is pretty fluffy and lots of holes, lots of air in it. You can see how it's moving around. So this one is my old lady, or I call it Freddie. Don't ask me why. People name all kinds of strange objects, but Freddie is pretty thick, pretty fluffy, and it was getting really big. And that's when I took a cup of it and put it into that other jar and I've been feeding both of them. I don't need to feed this today, but I do have to feed it later today. But before I feed it, because it's already getting so growing, I'm going to take a cup of starter out and use it for something. This weekend, I made banana bread with my sourdough starter. I made blueberry bread with my sourdough starter. So besides making loaves of bread, you can do a lot of different things with the sourdough starter. So now we're going to go back and just look at the mixture I had put together. This would be, if I were to just spread this out on a baking sheet, it would bake. It wouldn't be very tasty. So I'm going to help it along because I'm not going to waste the little bit of dough that I have here, because some days it's hard to even get flour in the grocery store. So I'm going to put a little bit of salt, just a little bit. Salt also helps in the reactions with the doughs. And now I'm going to add a tablespoon of oil. I'm using olive oil because I like the flavor it gives to crackers, but it doesn't have to be. And now, this is what's fun to watch, is the reaction of the oil, how it changes the dough. It was kind of gummy. Now, the oil helps smoothen out the oil molecules. It's a fat, are now being mixed in and suspended into the dough, so it totally changes the texture of the dough, which is the other important thing when we're working with doughs. But still, this is still kind of blah. So I'm just going to add some herbs to it, and I am going to bake it, spread it out on my baking sheet when we're done here, and bake this mixture of flour, water, a little bit of salt, a tablespoon of oil, and about a half a teaspoon of some herbs. I'm mixing, and now we have this kind of glistening mixture that will help us look at textures of doughs. Because now the dough would seem like it's kind of like playing with oobleck right now. You can spread it out and it springs back. So that's one of the things that's really interesting about the dough. And in this case, I'm going to take a while to do this. It takes a while to do this, so I'm not going to do it all right now. Spread it out as thin as I can. And I'm going to make some crackers, which is something that people have always done. It would be an unleavened bread that is very soft. For our final experiment today with sourdough, we're going to take some warm water. So this time I am using tap water because it won't hurt this. And I have a package. It looks kind of like it might be yeast, but it's a sourdough starter that I bought 20 years ago. That's a long time. So this is the experiment to see if this is going to now be able to turn into sourdough. So I need This recipe calls for a cup of water, and already this is a little different than making regular sourdough because we're starting from a dried. We're getting some bubbles in it. It's kind of hard to see, but there's some bubbles in it. That's because this sourdough starter, unlike a true sourdough starter that you started from scratch, has a little bit of yeast in it to give it the start. This was being sold as a tourist souvenir in one of the towns in Alaska. That was part of the Alaska Gold Rush. And the men who went to first the California Gold Rush and then the Alaska Gold Rush, they earned their rights to be considered a true miner once they could get their sourdough starter going. And so gold miners, especially in the Alaskan Gold Rush and the Yukon, they were known as sourdoughs. So this is mixing up. Now I need to add another bit of flour in. Being that I can kind of tell measurement wise, yep, I'm out of flour. This flour. So again, it's being mixed up the same way all the others. And this recipe, unlike all my other recipes, which says you have to feed the sourdough every day, you want to stir it and feed it. This recipe says to cover it up with some cheesecloth or some plastic wrap. Well, I just as soon use cheesecloth. I hate working with plastic wrap. So again, I have a dough. Looks very similar to all my other doughs. And I'm going to follow the directions, kind of flatten it out a little bit, neaten it up. Take my cheesecloth, which you can buy in the crafts section of Walmart or in Hobby Lobby, other places. It's used a lot in cooking as well as in crafts. So we're going to spread the cheesecloth out. I'm going to try to spread the cheesecloth out. And so I've got the cheesecloth on here, and I'm just going to put it in a quiet corner of the kitchen, and I'm going to wait and see what happens. So next time we get together, which will be on Thursday, where we're going to turn some sourdough into some bread, a true authentic sourdough loaf of bread, we will revisit that. We'll revisit my new starters, and we'll be using Freddie to help us make some bread. So be prepared to get your hands a little bit dirty and explore the wonders of sourdough bread. Thank you all very much. This has been great talking with you. And I apologize for you seeing my back a few times, but that was the only way I could get to the water. So have a great day. Go out and explore the wonders of science and the wonders of baking, because baking is science. Have a great day, everyone.